Welcome, everyone. We're so happy today to have Dorothy Lithicum back again. We've got an echo. Dorothy was here last year, almost exactly a year ago, speaking to us about spirituality and aging. You can't hear? So there's no microphone up here, right? Okay, so we just have to talk loud. I'll talk louder. So Dorothy has studied, she's taught courses, and has done workshops on older adult spirituality and ministry at Virginia Theological Seminary, which is in Alexandria. Dorothy was drawn to spiritual and theological dimensions of dementia when her mother was diagnosed about 20 years ago. And a few years after her mother's death, her father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so she became the primary caregiver for her father. She has written a book called Redeeming Dementia, Spirituality, Theology, and Science. And she's co-authored this with Janice Hicks. She presents workshops, gives lectures for churches and in classes about theology and spirituality, and in retirement communities. And so we're so happy to have Dorothy with us today.
Thank you so much. Now, if anybody's having trouble hearing, I'll remind you, as I do to my fine Episcopal brothers and sisters, there are seats in the front. Always seats in the front. I will try to speak up, but like everyone else, I'm getting older. So, but feel free. You know, those of us who are getting older face new challenges every day. The exercises I have been doing for 6 days a week for the past 7 years are getting harder, along with the morning run that I've had to shorten because of issues with my feet. Sometimes I can't remember a name or a place, although it usually pops up into my head later that day. It's hard not to wonder if my lapses are just forgetfulness or an early sign of dementia. It's an issue that is difficult to avoid as we grow older. Both of my parents died from complications from Alzheimer's disease. And as when you noted, I was the primary caregiver for my dad. Before he died, I began studying aging from different viewpoints, and of course, bumped right into dementia. Mostly because I was so immersed in learning about growing older, and partly because I feared and continue to fear that I will soon be included in the annual Alzheimer's statistics. Dementia, which is not a disease, but a symptom of different kinds of diseases and vascular mishaps, continues to be prevalent among the oldest in our population. After my parents' deaths, I wanted to know more about dementia, but just as important, I wanted to explore what does it mean to get older. Experiencing dementia with my parents increased my desire to better understand what happened to them. As an instructor at an Episcopal seminary, I had the latitude to follow my interests, and I began offering courses on aging and dementia. What does my faith have to say about these seemingly uncontrollable forces? I also began speaking at churches and church-based conferences about aging, although I found it hard to address dementia, the elephant that was always in the room. Then I got to know Janice Hicks, one of my students who took my class in 2017. She's a PhD chemist, and we began putting our stories together. her mother also had Alzheimer's. The result was a book called, and it's not going forward, Redeeming Dementia, which you already heard about. So thank you. All right. If it doesn't work the next time, we'll call her back over. So we looked at 3 different views because we felt like when we looked at what was already available, there were a lot of personal stories, but we decided to look at it from the aspect of science, which was Janice's purview, from theology, which was more my purview, and as spirituality. So I just want to give you some brief statistics about Alzheimer's. And I have the new 2004, but it's not up on this slide. I apologize. It estimated that there are nearly 7 million people with Alzheimer's in the United States. It's the most prevalent form of that causes dementias, of diseases. While there are many different kinds of illnesses that cause it, Alzheimer's counts between, they think, about 70 and 80% of people who have dementia have Alzheimer's. 1 in 3 seniors in the United States dies with Alzheimer's or another disease that causes dementia every year. Over 11 million Americans provide care for people with dementia, valued at more than $347 billion. The support that caregivers provide to loved ones is astounding, but they also have very serious needs that need to be addressed. Whenever I talk to groups, as I said earlier in my presentation, the topic of dementia always came up, usually after the presentation. People would come up to me and say, I've been diagnosed with moderate Alzheimer's. What does that mean? How do I know if I have it? And all of a sudden, I'm finding that when people learn that I've written this book, or they find out that I know something about dementia, I'll be at social events that have nothing to do with my profession, and people will sidle up to me and they ask that question again. How do I know if I have dementia already? As people grow older and memories sometimes dim, they wonder if they're entering into a new, frightening phase of life. But I want to cite to you my favorite theologian who actually changed my life, who wrote Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. He says, we are because God sustains us in God's memory. Our hope lies in the fact that we are living in the memories of God. As long as God remembers us, who we are will remain. In the book of Isaiah, the Lord said, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hand. Before going any further, I want to add a few caveats. Many of us here today will never experience dementia ourselves, although we are likely to know or care for someone who has dementia. Most of us will brush up against it in some way. And the toll of Alzheimer's on families can be debilitating. It's not only the cost, but if there are any problems within a family, it seems to make everything worse. So that's why we need to know about it and to be able to prepare to deal with it. But I have discovered that understanding dementia can deepen our relationship with a force greater than us and enable us to embrace our own vulnerability. Researcher and writer Brene Brown wrote, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. By accepting who and what we are, we can begin to live into the steadfast love that God offers to each of us and each of God's children. As Swinton says, knowing about God may not be as important as knowing God, and that knowing God involves a lot more than memory, intellect, and cognition. I'm also going to point out that redeeming dementia is not about redemption of those who have dementia, but about redeeming our own judgmental attitudes, our avoidance of those with dementia, and most of all, our fear. But I also say dementia is not a light topic. I can only say that some of my friends from from Christ Church in Alexandria have never talked to me about the topic or my book. And these are close friends. My husband wrote a book about the same time. They all bought his book. No one bought mine. Until recently, Janice and I have talked about this. Until recently, I would say that when people heard the name of our book, they would kind of go, "Oh, okay." And it would be like, I felt like I had, leprosy or something. But but even casual acquaintances, I mean, I can barely know somebody. I tell them I wrote this book, and they come to me when they can pull me aside and say, ask that question. How do I know if I have dementia? It's scary. Dementia is not a disease. I want to repeat that again, in and of itself. My co-author Janice says we've got to let people know that dementia is not a disease. It's not something you can catch from someone. It is the symptom of a disease. And it's not a mental illness. You can't fix it by pulling up your bootstraps. It is the symptom of a disease, and there are more than 25 common diseases that cause dementia, including Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, as we noted earlier, is by far the most common one. Then there is vascular dementia. This may occur in people who have long-term high blood pressure or after several small strokes. This is the second most prominent disease. Parkinson's often devolves into dementia. Dementia with Lewy bodies, which causes short-term memory loss and deterioration of muscular functions. Actor Robin Williams, that's the kind of dementia he had. Frontotemporal dementia. I have several friends that have been diagnosed with this type of dementia, including Tracy Lind, who's the former dean of the Episcopal Cathedral in Ohio, and Christine Bryden, a colleague in Australia, who's become my friend when she can remember who I am. Both are living fairly long lives and are forces to deal with despite long-term memory loss. I just saw Tracy at a wedding we were both at, and I talked to her caregiver, and I said, "What's it like?" And she said, "Dorothy, I retired, gave up my job so I could do full-time caregiving, and Tracy's just fine." She said they are looking at a new way of living. And there are things that we seem to be handling this disease better than we were because of better diets. People are taking sleep more seriously and so forth. The other thing is severe head injury that causes early onset dementia. I have a college friend who was in a severe car accident several years ago, and his dementia is increasing faster than normal. He started showing signs of dementia not long after that accident. In the sports world, concussions caused by physical impact among football players, which leads to dementia, has changed the sport incredibly. And they're trying to make it safer, although it's one of the most violent sports when you look at it, topped only by rugby, maybe. But anyway, we're all we're all thinking about it and thinking ahead about our future brain health. I will say at the same time, though, people with dementia maintain the other senses that when they might lose memory, but they still have other senses, including vision, smell, hearing, and touch. And it's why it's important that we keep up to date to make sure that we've had the latest hearing tests, that we have hearing aids that really work and that fit and that stay in without falling out, that we've had, if we need cataract surgery, that we can check that box and have it, and anything else that we can do to help us. One of my deep sadnesses is that my father absolutely did not trust cataract surgery and never got cataract surgery. So the same time he was slipping deeper and deeper into the world of dementia that makes everything blur, he was also losing his eyesight, and people just became blurry figures. Mm-hmm. So it's, you know, get those, be sure that anybody you love or yourself, you know, are ready to meet the challenges of being older. But, you know, the very topic of dementia still fills us with dread, even those untouched by one of these diseases I just mentioned. We fear the loss of control it inevitably brings and loss of relationships with those we love. We begin looking for signs of it in our own actions and those near us. For the most part, people that pull me aside want to know if their memory lapses are early warning signs. My first response always when somebody asks me about it is to go talk to your doctor. And if your concerns are not being answered, make an appointment with a neurologist. But I'm also aware that sometimes our aging brains are simply overloaded with too much information. The file drawers are full, and when we try to go back and open them and look and flip through it quickly, we can't find that word. As a writer, I'm always trying to write around those words that I can't come up with. But the other thing that happens then is that sometimes a word I didn't even know I knew pops up, and I have to look it up on Google to see what it means, and it is the exact word. So it's not all bad, some of these memory lapses. Not remembering a name, a place, or a specific word is not necessarily a sign of dementia, especially if the word comes to mind in a few hours or even the next day or two. I mean, be kind to yourself. In my studies, I came across, I love new words, anosognosia. It's a psychiatric and psychology term that means a neurological condition in which the patient is unaware of their neurological deficit or psychiatric condition. Or, in human terms, a person doesn't know that they don't know, which might be an early warning of memory loss and dementia. If you remember that you were looking for a specific word when it pops back into your head, there is less cause for concern. I have a handout, and okay, good. And it's not. And if you have my email address, you can always email me and I can send more. So, this handout is not written by me. It comes from the YouTube I watched by Dr. Rabin, who wrote the seminal book on Alzheimer's caregiving, which is called The 36-Hour Day. And it's based on his observations. Some of mine are thrown in as well, but it's based on his work. At the same time, the progressive decline of those with dementia often begins slowly, then becomes more obvious, although some may progress quickly and relentlessly. The debilitation is undeniable in later stages. I used to call my dad, who lived in Oklahoma, far from my home in Alexandria, every week. He would hold up his end of the conversation with ease. I have discovered since he could hold up. He could say those little things. Well, how are you doing, honey? How's work? The questions that seemed like we had a normal conversation. There's actually a place in the brain that stores that chit chat and allows us to bring it up and use it. It's probably created as a safety valve for our own safety. You know, the human body is amazing, and the brain keeps working. I mean, it is absolutely astounding. I later realized that he could insert those pat answers and responses in a phone conversation, while at the same time, he could no longer figure out how to make our washing machine work. He couldn't fix a cup of coffee. He didn't know what to do when somebody brought him a whole chicken already cooked. He said, "Why would somebody bring me a chicken cooked?" Not sliced. He didn't know what to do with it. I think it probably got thrown away. The popular social understanding is that dementia causes the loss of memory, but that turns out to be a cruel misrepresentation. The devastation is much more pervasive. As brain systems are progressively destroyed, behavioral and physical functioning become more and more impaired. I noticed a definite loss of logic in my parents' actions and thinking. This was followed by an inability to read or follow the TV shows they still watched out of habit. For many, along with their sense of dread, comes a feeling that dementia is the result of a moral failure or a mental disease that we could conquer by sheer will. If you want to talk about it, the condition is surrounded with secrecy and misinformation. The social stigma about mental health in general keeps people from reaching out to one another when they most need to. You are in a place right now that is the best equipped to help people wondering about this disease, especially with someone they love, a church. And yet I've had somebody at my church come to me and say, "I would never betray my husband by telling anyone he has dementia." We all already knew it. So let's be kind to each other and remember that you're in a place that is so, we can help each other through these difficult times. Alzheimer's Association has a free downloadable form with brief descriptions of 10 early warning signs of dementia. That's just the first page of it, but if you go online, you can get that. It's just helpful to have. For example, one sign is challenges in planning or solving problems, such as difficulty in managing finances or household bills. If you or a loved one is experiencing memory loss or basic reasoning skills that are disrupting your lives, then it may be time to visit your doctor. I didn't realize, I lived too far away from my dad, that his water had been turned off at least twice in the 6 months before I moved him to Virginia. He just didn't know what to do with bills, and I don't think he remembered how to write a check, and I don't know if he could find a check. I also had to straighten out tax returns for a while. So anything we can do to help each other. And just remember, it's not just memory. It's the ability to do those things that we've always been able to do. In her book, Finding Magic, Sally Quinn, a former reporter at the Washington Post, discusses her marriage to Ben Bradley, a one-time executive director of the Post, and living with dementia in the years before his death. We didn't hear about that, those of us who lived in Washington, because it was the best kept secret. She describes how colleagues and family members protected Bradley, but never openly talked with him about his diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Oh, how lonely Ben Bradley's life must have been. Several years into his disease, his wife finally began telling close associates that Bradley had dementia. It was done, she said. We were heading into a new life, a life I was dreading, and yet a life that would be fulfilling in a way I could never have imagined. The A word is a killer, which is why I always say dementia. Somehow Alzheimer's sounds like something you could catch. Dementia sounds tamer, more like gentle aging. Ironically, confronting the reality of dementia head-on is probably the best way to deal with it. The telling of our stories is the best antidote to get some perspective and ease our fears, as opposed to remaining silent, allowing fear to dominate our lives. In the early stages of my mother's Alzheimer's, she probably had late moderate diagnosis of the disease. She used to walk around the house at night and stand at doors looking in. And I would lay in bed at night on a visit and lie there as still as I could, but please don't come in, please don't come in, please don't come in. And she usually just drifted on. And I returned to the seminary, and I was having lunch with a colleague, Bishop Mark Dyer, and I told him this story. I was hoping to say, oh, bless your heart. What he said was, well, Dorothy, your mother has much to teach you, and you better start learning. Ooh. Those words kind of stayed in my heart and mind. And the next visit, when she was roaming at night and I was lying in my bed, when she came to my doorway, I pulled the covers back and gestured for her to come in. She came in, took my hand, and fell deeply asleep. Fear is the worst part of dementia. It also helped me remember that she used humor and laughter all through my adolescence to get me through the angst of those times in adolescence when you're so vulnerable. And we started using humor more and more. And we would go on walks. One time we both laughed so hard. She said, I have to sit down or I'm going to pee. So she sat down on the curb and we couldn't stop laughing. And for those few moments, I always had my mother back. But most of us are unprepared intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually for a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's disease in someone we love, much less ourselves. Even as we watch the progression of dementia, we rationalize that what we are seeing and how we respond. During this time when we are overwhelmed with decisions that must be made, health issues to be confronted, doctors to be found, and financial realities to be navigated, it is easy to lose sight of the person we are so focused on. And sometimes they lose sight of us. My dad, who was in a high-rise assisted living and in a memory unit, but before they moved him to the memory unit, he would look out his window and see the Ford Mercury exactly like the one he had owned for years and years and years. He would gather up his room key and his wallet, head down the stairs and break in if he could. Not thinking he was breaking in, but if the car was unlocked, he'd just get in it and sit, perfectly happy. Of course, the person who owned the car was not perfectly happy. And I said, you're just going to have to lock it. So, but I have to say, also, when we talk about my dad, my brother often calls him Norval, Dad's given name, because naming him fleshes out his personality for us and ties us to the person that we remember from when we were children. My brother told me he stopped seeing the Norval in our dad during the last months of his life. Like most caregivers, we didn't have much guidance for this new role in which we had been thrust. We hadn't read theology about the self or encountered people who have dementia who have become advocates for others who have dementia. My brother recently told me that one of his biggest regrets was his inability to connect with Norval when he was with him at the end of his life. I think, said my brother, as I look back at the last months of his life and all that he had to cope with, that Norval was simply doing the best that he could. A reminder for caregivers always that the person, even when they're belligerent, sometimes mean, sometimes petty, things that we all do all the time anyway, that they're simply doing the best that they can. I had an uncle who called me once a month. He lived in West Texas, never got to see my dad after I moved him to Virginia, but he'd call me once a month and say, Dorothy, you are doing such a good job. That's what I needed to hear every month. And I'll tell you, if that's the only thing you do, give yourself a star in your crown, because that is so important to have somebody be told you're doing a good job. I got so worried about finances, I kind of lost sight of my dad too. I was trying to break CDs and doing stuff. I went to a bank and asked how much it would cost for me to break into a CD. And he said, did you bring any bills? I said, yes. And I showed him the bills. And he said, we'll break it with we won't take away any of the interest that you've earned. And I just started crying. But people are kind if we but ask. Even big companies. This was Bank of America. Finding my dad's self often seemed beyond me as his caregiver. Between his confused mind and my own lack of clarity from increasing worry, I missed the words of wisdom that he was still giving me all the time. Humor from car break-ins and his ability to laugh at himself were the antidotes that cleared the clouds for both of us. Because researchers have never identified one distinct part of the brain as a person's self, which we sometimes might in the church refer to as a soul, it is not possible for dementia to claim that self or for any of us to lose ourselves, despite the questions and uncertainty that arise from the reality of living with dementia. In 2017, I met a remarkable woman named Christine Bryden, who had had dementia for over 25 years, the frontal lobal disease. When she speaks at conferences around the world to this day, people attending her academic presentations, especially medical professionals, scoff at the idea she has dementia. She said in a presentation, I seek to change these outsider views which speak for me and about me rather than letting me express verbally or non-verbally my continuing sense of self. We have been conditioned, maybe by the speed at which Alzheimer's disease sometimes attacks the brain, to look for significant memory loss and an inability of people with dementia to function normally. Her words brought to mind other descriptions I've heard people say about those who have dementia. It's so sad to see someone stripped of her humanity. There's simply no there. He doesn't know if I visit or not. All that's left is an empty shell. These observations can be traced to our culture's embrace of hyper-rationality. Its hold on our thinking goes back to the 16th century with Rene Descartes' observation, I think, therefore I am. Do the opposite of that, I can't think, so I'm not. And that's just wrong. And Christine's life shows how shallow and untrue these observations are. The resiliency we find generally in older people, like all of us sitting around dealing with many issues in our health and other things, and we're still going. Well, the same thing happens for people with dementia. They have the same kind of ability to face obstacles with hope and perseverance. There's a tender beauty and grace in the way those with dementia maintain the dignity of themselves that we fail to see when we make dismissive judgments about them. The worst thing about making those judgments is hearing those words ourselves. I said them myself when my father seemed to be losing his self. And it didn't hurt him, it hurt me. It made me less than, not him, that judgment. I recently read a book by a woman named Noga Arika. She's high on my list. She's a philosopher, trained in many fields, who wrote a book called The Ceiling Outside. She said, our bodies carry our life's memories, which constitute who we are at any given point in time. When one sense is disrupted, damaged, or destroyed, like smell for those who had COVID, our embodied sense of self, or who we are within the present moment, is affected. When a disease like Alzheimer's attacks the brain, the sense of self that shapes who we are is disrupted, but never destroyed. This is the message of hope for those affected by dementia in themselves or someone that they love. I want to remind us all that rationality has its limits. It does not define ourselves or our identity as beloved children and a part of God's steadfast love forever. Dr. Daniel C. Potts, a neurologist and writer who works with people who have dementia, recently wrote, when we say things like, that's not my mom anymore, or I knew he wasn't the same person, or all that's left is an empty shell, what we are describing is not something that is happening to a person with dementia, but something that is happening in our own minds. What we are losing is our own ego's construct of who a person is, not that person losing it themselves. Nothing, not even Alzheimer's or another dementia, can steal personhood. It is imparted, inviolate, and unending. The physical manifestation we perceive of that personhood may be changing, but the core is unchangeable. It is unfair to hold someone accountable to be what our own egos have constructed them to be. Instead, let's learn to love the sacred inside a person, the person as they truly are and will remain. Theologian John Swinton, he had such a dramatic effect in my own life and my own acceptance of what dementia really was. Says that if we are only our memories, if our sense of self is determined by what we can remember about the world and ourselves, then losing memory eventually means losing self. However, he writes, human beings are much more than bundles of memories. Devastating as dementia undoubtedly is, the human beings experiencing it do not dissolve. They are certainly changed, and there's much suffering and cause for lament. But these people remain rightly held within the memories of God. It is our ideas about what humanness, the nature of the self, and self-fulfillment mean that will have to be dissolved and recreated. All of us need to redeem dementia for ourselves. In the busyness of our lives, those of us who don't have symptoms of dementia too often spend most of our time looking back or forward. We depend on linear time, which I must say is a wonderful gift when we must endure unpleasant parts of our lives. I have thanked God that God realized, while God is not bound by linear time, I need it. I need to know that this moment will end. I need to know that this sadness will finally go by me. I need to know that joy is around the corner, and linear time gives me that hope. At the same time, linear time too often rules our thinking and limits our imaginations about who and what and where God is. Surely God, moves easily from one dimension to another, all-knowing, all-powerful. I keep photos right here on the Webb telescope on my computer, on my laptop, on the desktop. If we can escape to a nonlinear view of time by stepping out of a current reality, we can loosen our ties to preconceived ideas that allow us to see an incident more clearly. The thought that God is operating thousands of light years away in this universe, still creating, just gives me such hope and understanding that that same God can love me with a steadfast love that I will never be able to totally comprehend. The same people that some describe as having lost their humanity are able to transcend a current state to move into an alternate reality that makes sense in their world that is often filled with confusion. The new place they enter often brings them both comfort and delight. I want to show a 6-minute video, if it works. It was created by
and people are very old and deteriorated, and no one enters their world, and they're just sitting there. They will withdraw inward more and more, and their desperate need for connection is all now inside. And if a person is all alone, even if they're very, very deteriorated, there's a longing for this kind of closeness. Mrs. Wilson? Hello. You want me to sit? Can you see me good? Gladys Wilson is a wonderful example of a person who is in the phase of repetitive motion, where people use movements, repetitive movements, because they don't have any more speech or very little speech, but they have human needs that need to be expressed. Crying. Crying, you have a tear right here in your face. You have a little pain. You want me to touch you? You sad? Can you see me? You afraid? And if this person sits with their eyes closed, rocking back and forth, and maybe there's a tear coming down, there's a need there. There's a little tear that's coming out. You feel it? You feel a little tear? If you gently use touch, and I touched Gladys Wilson for the fingertips right here on the cheek, is where the mother usually touches a child. If you touch an infant there, it looks up. And every cell remembers where it was touched by the mother. And often that person knows, even if they can't say a word at that moment, they won't talk, or they don't want to talk, but there's a communication. And that person is no longer alone. Can you let me in a little bit? You think? Just a little? Think I could be with you and Jesus for a minute? Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. I used music, because when speech is gone, music, especially with Gladys Wilson, it was religious music, because there's emotion tied to it and safety tied to it. So I used her old church song, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. What I did was, when she moved, I moved with her. And when I was singing, because she didn't sing with me, So I matched the intensity of my voice to the intensity of her movement. And pretty soon, for a split second, we became one person. Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. So at one point, when she got very quiet and very peaceful, and my voice became very quiet as hers and very peaceful, and my breathing slowed to her breathing, she pulled me to her, and I moved with her. And for her, at that moment, I believe I was a symbol of her mom. Safe mom. Got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the mothers and the fathers. He's got the breakthrough doesn't happen every time. Person will not always look there, open their eyes and look at you. But if you keep trying and you keep centering yourself and really look at that person and really mirror their movements, maybe not this time, but the next time you come, you'll have a communication. Feel safe. Jesus.
Naomi Fail is a social worker. She's Jewish and knows every childhood Christian song in the books. She's amazing. I like to show this for several reasons. One is the power of music to reach people. It is interesting to me, when we were created, we were first, before evolution came in and changed things, we began with the brain stem, and then a cerebellum was created, which has the basic things that tells you, that tells your body to breathe, that you're hungry. It's located way in the back here, less likely to be affected by harm to the hippocampus and other parts of the brain that dementia begins to break down. Well, guess where music is located? In the cerebellum. So music has always meant to be a way for us to reach to each other and to provide community. If you have someone you love who's in a later stage of dementia that can't hear well, you can still get earphones that are comfortable, start the music playing, and then put them on their heads. Hearing aids often don't stay in people's ears very long because they pull them out too often. But if you use headphones, they'll stay. And you can play music that you might be able to after the music's played, actually have a conversation, because it highlights those parts in the brain that you couldn't highlight any other way. It's amazing. Music is just such a wonderful way for us to communicate. And our Creator made that possible.
Would you say the same with touch also? Because I noticed that touch was so important.
Yes, it was very important. And that's why, and sometimes when I'm with somebody, I spend time at assisted living in memory units, and I don't try to touch on the face. I usually try to touch a hand first until they're comfortable. But it is amazing what that touch right there will do. Try it with a 2-year-old. It works there too, because there are some memories there, some deep memory. that aren't destroyed because of a disease. Death and life are experienced not only in the biggest and most defining acts of our lives, but also in the when we have to give something up or move something over to make room for God's grace to grow and live in our lives. Those with dementia often don't have control about where they live, when they have to get up, what they eat, or who they will see. They have to put away every parts of their lives they can no longer control or even remember. And yet they invite us to join them in the present, to enter an alternative reality that transcends our worlds and to connect intimately with God. Though often wordless, they ask us to set aside negative opinions, judgments, expectations, or even lofty goals so that we can live our lives in the place we are right now. Even through confusion, they ask us to embrace the hope of resurrection. In doing so, they can redeem dementia for us all. Just to say, when I started, I did a workshop for the Maryland Association for Psychology last year. And they had never in 50 years of existence used a workshop that had the word spirituality in it, but it was called Dementia and Spirituality. The thing that I discovered in doing my work and research to prepare for that 3-hour workshop was to discover how many professionals that are now studying and talking about dementia that there weren't 10 years ago. And neurologists, neuroscientists, psychiatrists, psychologists, philosophers, gerontologists, theologians, spirituality experts, and more. The exciting thing to me is not only how their understanding has shifted, but also their embrace of similar language to describe it. They all of them use the word that I heard from Christine Bryden 7 years ago, the self. And how do they describe it? For the most part, they believe that the self is a compilation of all the experiences a person has ever had. That means each person has a unique self that cannot be destroyed by illness or brain dysfunction. These words immediately remind me of theologian John Swinton, neurologist Daniel Potts, and of God's steadfast love for each of us. So my word to you today is a word of hope. It is not to belittle the difficulties that this disease causes or the tragedies it causes in families. But it is not the end. God doesn't create us to destroy us. It is part of the journey. I think we're out of time, but does anybody have any questions? Is to create a memory box for yourself. It's too late when you have dementia for somebody else to come in and say what's most important to you. This is my memory box. My mother thoughtfully gathered pictures of my very early pictures of my childhood and gave them to me when I was married. Took me longer, but I have done the same thing for my children. The pictures that are there are the pictures I'm going to remember. We don't remember things. People who have dementia don't remember things that happened in the last 10 years. They remember what happened in the last 50, 60, 70 years. So that picture book are the people that were most important, that have been long gone, for many cases, out of my life, but who bring back wonderful memories. I grew up a Southern Baptist. Music was very important to me. And that's the hymnal that was in the church pews when I was a child. I've asked my kids, I said, most memory units and assisted living have a piano. Find somebody who can play the Christmas carols in there and you'll light up the whole place for everyone. So I said, leave the Episcopal book at home because it doesn't speak to my heart at all. Sometimes my mind, but that's about it. And I also have my own music and it's on an iPod, but iPod stopped They don't, it's no longer active. So I've asked my kids to take my playlist and put it somewhere that they can keep updating it for me if I need that. And, leaving it to someone else. My husband's favorite music are the Allman Brothers and the Rolling Stones. God save me if I have to listen to that music coming right into my ears. But so I'm just suggesting to you, if you want to assure that you have some control over your own life, put together a memory box. I have writings in there because people always say, I just never know what to say. Well, I've written them stories that they can come read me. And I said on one of them, I said, before you come and read the story, go to the grocery store, buy some raspberries, set them in the sun so that they have that wonderful smell, and then read the story. But you can. So, I mean, if I want to go certain places, I've left stories to tell people how to take me there.